Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh, and as you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the American musician and record producer. It's the one and only Paul Roessler, who I spoke to recently to find out more about life, love and poetry. Was part of the LA punk scene during the late 70s and 80s. Has been a life in music and is currently now a record producer and has his own studio in Silver Lake, which is in LA. But he was in such bands as The Screamers, Twisted Roots, 45 Grey, Nervous Gender, has played with such people as Nina Hagen. But this is the interview, and that's what you want to listen to, basically. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years. Paul, it's over to you.
Well, I'm a little older than you. So I can remember, when I'm a little kid, the first stuff I listened to. I think my mom had all the Peter, Paul, and Mary records.
Yes.
And she played that, which, it sounds incredibly cheesy and silly, but it's actually a great introduction to protest music and early, it's kind of the slicked up commercial version of very politically aware music. My dad played a lot of Wagner and Beethoven and classical music in the house. I think someone gave me, when I was about 10 years old, someone gave me Sgt. Pepper's. So I was a big crazy Beatle guy. I had a older uncle. He was 7 years older than me, and he used to give me a record every year. And he gave me Donovan, and he gave me the band, and he gave me, the Woodstock. So I kind of was in the mainstream classic rock as a 10 or 11-year-old. But I had a series of awakenings. I had a Rolling Stones awakening. My friend was a Rolling Stones fanatic, and he, a lot of times it's associated when you're a teenager with you drop acid, and then you have this like religious experience around the band. So I had a dropping acid religious experience around the Rolling Stones, and then eventually, with my friend Paul Beam, who later became known as Darby Crash, I had a religious awakening on acid with David Bowie.
Oh,
so that, yeah.
That is amazing. Because strangely enough, I don't know if you had this experience at all, but my parents had been kind of into music. My dad had, but they were that kind of working class generation that when they got married, I think they just basically sold everything they owned just to get some money. They never borrowed money. That was a generation that did not borrow money. So they just work, save money, buy something. So I think he liked Elvis and Teresa Brewer and these kind of 50s people like that. I don't know, sort of, and then country and western. He loved sort of people like Jim Reeves and Boxcar Willie, really terrible country and western. But I had an older brother who was 7 years older, and we got a record player introduced to the house in the early 70s, mid 70s, and and it was interesting because he bought the Sgt. Pepper album and Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, and I remember sneaking into his room and playing these records religiously and being absolutely mesmerized because there was no cultural context at that stage about either of these. And then you look back and you think, God, the Beatles had only just broken up, really. But I remember being obsessed with a track called Good Morning on side 2. And all these kind of, it was a fascinating kind of experience. But one in his room, listened to that because there was no one else that I could talk to. I'd just be listening to the lyrics about She's Leaving Home and Day in a Life and thinking, wow, this is interesting. And then Goodbye Yellow Brick Road had this amazing track on side 4 called Harmony, which was this beautiful kind of melancholic track. I was like, oh my God. That's just blown my brain, So
I've been thinking a lot about listening to music without cultural context and stripping away nostalgia and trying to listen to music for strictly on content. Now, that's a little bit. It's just one way of listening to music because obviously the importance of music is its impact on culture. But being a pure musician and a composer, I really am interested in what about the actual boiled down to the notes, the message, the melody, the clearest possible distillation, completely separate from culture. So it's interesting that you say that. It's a different way of listening to music.
Yes, and especially when you're sneaking into your brother's bedroom to listen to it while being forbidden. And it's interesting you mentioned Peter, Paul and Mary, because my parents did buy a couple of records when the record player appeared, and one of them was the Carpenters, and that had a profound effect on my life, and it still does, because I still think lyrically, again, I was 11 probably, and it was just like, God, these lyrics, I just was amazed with the lyrics. It was just
The thing I noticed when I listened to Peter Paul Mary, I was only like 6 years old, but I noticed that all my favorite songs, and they had who wrote the song next to each song, and they said a lot of them were like traditional old folk songs, right? But some of my favorite songs were all written by someone named B. Dylan. And so later, and then they had a song called Bob Dylan's Dream, and I was like, oh, B. Dylan. I was 6 years old. I'm figuring all this out. I'm like, that must be Bob Dylan. Who is Bob Dylan? And then I eventually got a Bob Dylan record. So I had definitely a religious experience over Bob Dylan. And the one other religious experience I forgot about was my religious experience over Yes. Well, the first time I discovered Yes, and that was a big one for me. That never wore off.
No, that didn't. Well, bizarrely, you mentioned that, because my brother was that generation who was into prog rock. It was prog rock. There was no 7-inch singles. It was just albums. They were put in plastic sleeves. So Yes, Genesis, Wishbone Ash, Barclay James Harvest, and the solo work of Rick Wakeman. And
Jethro Tull, Emerson, Lake and Palmer were two of my favorites also. And I wrote a 47-minute song. I had a prog band, and I recorded it in 2012, and it's I was able to actually, after 40 years, hold the vinyl in my hand that I had written when I was 16. It was amazing.
Yes,
like dream come true.
It was quite amazing. And again, I remember putting on King Arthur, the album King Arthur, and being like, listening to this vocal, which I think was Vivian Stanshall, but doing the narrative, and then Journey to the Center of the Earth, and the Six Wives of Henry VIII. Or the Six Wives of Henry. Yeah, I was absolutely mesmerized with Rick Wakeman. I just loved Rick Wakeman.
Being a keyboard player, I was really trying to ape that. But then by 1976 or 77, all of those great prog bands, and they'd all done their best work, and they were all kind of putting out sort of bad, bloated. And then the next big spiritual experience was hearing the Sex Pistols and going and seeing the Germs and the Deadbeats at the Whiskey, and realizing music had been reborn.
Yes. But interestingly enough, because, having a bit of an obsessive personality at times, well, not that obsessive really, quite liberal, but I did get to the source of prog rock. I found the absolute source of prog rock, which was really interesting, because being a David Bowie obsessive, I was like, I would try to interview anybody who'd played with him or worked with him, or even, his ex-wife, his manager, his friend who punched him in the eye, just anybody connected with David Bowie, Ava Cherry, Dana Gillespie, Garson Slick, Tony DeFries, Angie Bowie, all those people, I've interviewed them all. And then he sort of mentions in the 90s a band that he liked in the 60s called Clouds, or 1-2-3 they're called. And there was a Scottish prog band that started in the 60s, and he mentions them in an interview, and everyone's like confused, like, who are you talking about? And anyway, it turns out that they were a Scottish prog band, and they featured a guy called Billy Ritchie on keyboards. So I kind of did an interview with Billy Ritchie, and he was like, yeah, we were kind of basically referred to as the first ever prog band. So if you ever watch any prog documentaries, and they're well done, they go back to this band, Billy Ritchie, and Bowie gets Clouds. And they started as 1-2-3. They changed it. They started in 1964, and he told me that in those early gigs that all those members of prog bands turned up to watch them, and David would hang around with him, and just because at that time, he was hanging out with people like Billy Ritchie was hanging out with people like Jimi Hendrix, and Bowie was like, oh, can I come along with you and hang out with you, and sort of and then he has a moment on stage where he gets really fed up, smashes up his instrument, and never plays another note again in his life. So there you go. I'll send you the link to one of his interviews.
Fascinating. I mean, I think prog, it's sort of I think of the punk movement as progressive also. It's like we're in a lull, we're in a rut, things have gotten stale, and then you progress out of it. And I think the prog rockers just saw like, well, what would happen if we, abandoned blues riffs, or what happened if we did odd meters, and like that's just forward thinking. Progressive music is associated with a certain era, but I just think it's all music. It's a sort of a repeating thing where there's traditionalists and then there's people who are trying to recreate. And I record people in my studio where they're really reverent of the past and they want to sound like the past. And then I have people that are, so can we somehow figure out something completely different?
Yes, this does happen. And were your parents at all influential in your kind of direction in life?
Well, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. My dad was at Yale, and I will say, people use the word narcissist a lot, and they mean somebody who takes a lot of selfies. And narcissism is actually a condition. And in my home, my father sort of believed that he was a sort of a superior man, and that therefore his children would be superior human beings. He moved us to the Caribbean to sort of fertilize us, and took us scuba diving and piano lessons at an early age. And so the way they influenced me was, and I think my sister also, is we were very driven to accomplish things, which only lately have I started to understand that there's other options besides being driven to accomplish. And there's things like enjoying life, or just to be a kind person, like really valid endeavors. But those things never really brought in our house. And it was not really on Kira. It was like, because he was sort of a product of the 50s and very sexist, and he didn't care what his daughter did. He didn't expect much from his daughter, but his son, he expected. And I always felt like nothing less than Beethoven or Freud or Darwin, or had to be something. And it's a sort of a pathology that I've had to sort of, that was the really probably the big influence of. And I see it in Kira too. Kira, it was more, you have to take me seriously. I am your offspring. Just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I'm not the same. And so we have this very, both of us, driven personalities.
Yes, I could imagine you were hothoused, weren't you, really? You were an experiment of
hothouse flowers that I would say were not ever completed, because my parents got divorced, a very messy divorce, when I was about 13 and Kira was about 10. It was very messy, and we split, and our circumstances drastically changed. So it's kind of like I was groomed to spend a life in academia or something, and then just dropped in Los Angeles to become punk rockers.
Blimey.
So,
that's not the best
Oh, it's the best. No, it's the best. It's the greatest. I didn't want to spend my life in academia. I'm glad. I wouldn't change a thing. I brought all these fierce tools into, I feel like punk rock and roll also needs people with rigor. That's what's, I like I'm not a big fan of the just get wasted and get stoned and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I think that actually, these days I'm starting to think that was kind of a wrong turn, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I like the people with rigor that took it very seriously and really, really took themselves seriously. I'm good with that.
Yes, I remember doing an interview with JJ French from Twisted Sister, and he's of a work ethic, isn't he? Which is quite sort of, it seemed very strong, during the 70s, of trying to get the band going and getting rejected, but kept going and going and going. And yes, just had that kind of real thing about sort of working really hard, which I think slightly different from American bands to British bands, actually. It's an interesting one. I think we're slightly lazy in the UK, and if it doesn't come that easily with too little, without much effort, then we just kind of give up. Whereas Americans do try a lot harder, actually. And
I don't know. I mean, Bowie tried and tried and tried. He had every reason to throw in the towel after several failures. And I think the Beatles were hardworking when they went to Hamburg, but I think I know it's a gross generalization, and hey, it doesn't matter. The British music is just as great as the American music, so whether you're lazy or a workaholic, I think some of the workaholics get a little precious. I mean, I think Frank Zappa is a workaholic, and I have a great admiration for Frank Zappa, but I think if he would have shot a little heroin, it might have helped him. And the same with Jacob Collier. Jacob Collier, absolutely one of my most brilliant musicians I've ever, found in my life, but I feel like he needs some sorrow and some suffering and maybe even some laziness or some sort of living that would temper his brilliance.
Yes, well, it's interesting you mentioned vaguely mentioned that idea of being damaged, because I remember there was a club in Liverpool called Eric's that in the sort of 70s punk period, and it was one of those ones where I suppose there was a meeting of lots of people, and it was just the right time, right place at the right time with all these people who formed various bands, who then went on to be Frankie Goes to Hollywood or Bill Drummond, who the KLF, and there was the guy from Lightning Seeds and Echo and the Bunnymen and Julian Cope, and Jane Casey was there. And I remember an interview where she said, you know, we all wore our sort of neurosis on stage. You know, we were all sort of messed up, and but we had this club and we had this stage that we could just be as crazy as we could, and it did work. But I think in a way, a bit like you mentioned with Bowie. I mean, he spent the 60s kind of trying and failing quite spectacularly, really. And I just watched that film, Love You Till Tuesday, and you're thinking, God, this came out in 1960, was it 67, 69? I was thinking, what were you doing, David? This is the most bizarre thing. You know, you had, Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, the Beatles, the Stones, etc., etc. And then you had this kind of, it was like, wow, I didn't see what was coming next at all, did we really? So it's it's an interesting one, really.
And he had the damage. He had the damage from his brother, and he had, he could have drawn on that, but he was still. It really took the cocaine and maybe even Angie, something knocked him out, and he morphed.
He morphed. He did. It's
really
kind
did.
of. I think he had an amazing curiosity with other art forms, though, didn't he? He had his Lindsay Kemp, he had his kind of performance theatre people, and I think he had that family life that he really wanted to escape from, and I think that was kind of a massive factor. So, vaguely. So then you were sort of a talented keyboard player with classical kind of chops, and then what happens during the mid 70s when you get to the age of 16? That kind of, did you stay on to college, or did you leave?
I had my prog band, and we were working on the 47-minute song, and then that just sort of fell apart, and I just looked around at rock music, and I just didn't see a place for myself. And so I went and studied classical music for about a year. And right after at Northridge in Los Angeles, I was a music major. And then right when I went there and I was kind of walking away, my friends started the Germs, and they invited me to a show. And there was a band called The Deadbeats, and The Deadbeats were sort of like a punk version of Captain Beefheart or Frank Zappa. They had odd meters and very strange harmonies. And then, of course, there was this. So I really loved what I was seeing there. There was a band called The Weirdos that was just amazing. I was really a fan. And then there was a band called The Screamers that was looking for a keyboard player. And The Screamers had no guitars or bass. They were just keyboards, drums, and a singer. And it was perfect for me, so I joined that band, and that was a really popular band in Los Angeles at the time.
Yes, that has become sort of that sort of cult band. So did you, at that stage, had you sort of rejected all your kind of musical kind of knowledge and sort of skills to sort of not dumb down, but to sort of use it differently?
Yeah, well, for sure, use it differently. I mean, the Screamers, the Screamers are basically octaves and fifths, because I'm playing through a distorted Fender Rhodes through a distortion. And so I'm really like doing power chords on guitar a lot, sometimes kind of fast, but so it was still hard to play, but there's very little harmony. But playing at guitar player speeds, punk rock speeds, it was still challenging. I couldn't be too snooty about my classical chops, because playing punk rock on keyboards was pretty hard, actually. I had to really stay focused and keep my wits about me. And I was kind of generating most of the noise along with the drummer. The other keyboard player was doing more washes, synth washes, and more color stuff. So I did have to rethink, but really early on, I always wanted to, I thought that one of the main things about punk rock, one of the main cornerstones of its ideology, was to be authentic. And so I knew that I really could not deny my past. And I also think, but if you cut off an arm, then you're a guy with only one arm. Maybe you proved a point, but I would rather be the guy with two arms. So I've always tried to find a way to integrate, either through, it has to be more subtle, but I still like to throw in odd meters or some sort of dissonant harmonies. I find that traditional harmony, to me, sounds kind of cheesy, and the more advanced jazz harmony gets, the more like lounge music it sounds, in a way, for me, to me. So while it's very complicated and difficult, it's not a fascination for me to bring Thelonious Monk harmonies into punk music. So that didn't really work. But technique and just not being lazy and being I mean, sometimes in the screamers, there would be things where the left hand would be doing a very independent thing from the right hand, which is really hard to do. Like, I'm kind of doing a bass line with the left hand in a whole tone scale, and the right hand's doing something else. So while it may not sound as obvious as a Rachmaninoff piano concerto or something, it was all I could handle.
Yes. I always remember sort of Rick Wakeman explaining his kind of piece on Life on Mars and how he takes that quite differently, where the obvious, David didn't want him to play where he thought he was going to go. He sort of changes the tempo and the key, and it's like, and that's the thing that makes it so special. It's that kind of those little details, isn't it, which suddenly gives something such an iconic sound.
You talk about prog music. Life on Mars uses just about every chord there is that you can invent. And I noticed it in some other songs that you would notice with David Bowie, and I don't know exactly how he does it, but Life on Mars has got a lot of chords. It's not something you can kind of just jam along to. So, and I remember Wakeman talking about that. He's like, he wanted to do something a little bit flowery, but you confronted, it's like, oh my God, David, how did you even come up with that? Because it's not a simple song.
No.
Bowie songs are very interesting harmonically.
But then I've learned that the world of the Carpenters and Burt Bacharach is equally as complicated as well. When people go to play them, it's like, actually, these are really quite complicated tracks, aren't they? They're not.
They are. It's annoying. It's annoying because I'm not a super, like, I've worked very hard and I've studied very hard, but some people, that stuff comes very naturally, and it doesn't come very naturally to me. It really doesn't. And so it's really annoying to hear these really simple Burt Bacharach songs, and think you could sit down and play and just realize I don't even know what he's doing. Where somebody get me the sheet music.
Yes. So with the Screamers, there isn't a lot of kind of studio time with the band. It's obviously a live band. How come you didn't sort of record an album with them?
Well, we did do some demo recording, but I know the thought at the time, this was 1978. The thought at the time was that the Screamers music could never translate to radio, and radio was the only way to break music back then. I mean, they weren't even playing. You listen to the Sex Pistols now, and it's kind of like just sort of generic rock and roll in a way, with a guy howling over the top of it. But the Screamers music was pretty off the wall, and I think they just felt that there was sort of a futility to it. The interesting about the Screamers is I don't think they were ever that fascinated with being a band. It was really a stepping stone. I think the guys in the Screamers, I think Tomato wanted to be an actor, and I think the guys in the Screamers wanted to create something like a production house or something where they could make movies, videos, and MTV didn't exist yet. Yes. So I think they kind of wanted to create a studio and a business and an art factory. And the band was kind of, and it's so funny, like Bowie, who is very contrived and yet feels so sincere in a way, and yet he's not sincere. He's not speaking from himself. He's not confessional at all, I don't think, Bowie. But sometimes those people just do the best work. They're removed from their art. They're not worried about their feelings particularly, and they just cut and paste together something really, really strong with that. I'm a romantic composer. I'm a confessional songwriter. I'm a person that writes from my life, because that's where I find emotional connection. But people like Bowie and the Screamers somehow are able to create very emotional music, and they're completely at a remove. So I find that kind of fascinating.
Yes, there is kind of an abstract kind of style, I suppose. Yeah, Bowie is kind of, the lyrics, when they're so iconic, but then at the same time you think, I'm not quite sure what they mean, but they sound good, don't they? They capture sort of a magic realism almost of
I mean, occasionally he'll tell you, well, I was reading this book and you'll go, that's what you were, I remember I think it was Station to Station. He goes, everything in that is from the Kabbalah, so And I remember Robert Smith once was talking about one of his songs. It was some beautiful, lovely song. It just sounded like he was brokenhearted about his girlfriend. And he said, "Oh, that's actually from the writings. I don't know, Baudelaire, somebody." So sometimes these people, they're working on their 10th or their 15th record, and I've had to do this too. And you realize, what am I going to write about? And then you just pick up the nearest thing you've been reading, and that turns into a song. You jumble it up.
Well, I think with Robert Smith, was it Killing an Arab? Was that Camus who took
Well,
that
that's
type?
Camus, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
Camus. And then Morrissey and the Smiths, I mean, he was always borrowing some really, there was a woman called, Elizabeth Smart, some sort of book called I Sat Down at Central Station and Wept, and he kind of borrowed, and there was a film called Taste of Honey, and he borrowed quite a few lines from that, and then sort of mixes them with a few other his sentiments, and they become these classic, iconic moments, really, which is quite interesting. So look, as the sort of the late 70s progressed into the 80s, in the UK, we had obviously, the great political turning of kind of Margaret Thatcher appearing, and then this Conservative government, which had quite an ethos. And then we had the Falkland War, then we had the miners' strike, then we had Greenham Common. We thought we were all going to die of a nuclear war. So what was it like in America at this stage for you in this sort of that transition time?
Well, so we had Reagan starting in 1980, and there was also a shift. But we also had unlike England, perhaps, I mean, immense explosion of wealth, I think, and horrible conspicuous consumption and Wall Street gluttony. But most of my friends were absolutely poverty stricken. I had 2 children, and I played with Nina Hagen in the beginning of the 80s, and I did some tours, so I did okay for that. But I kind of quit that band, and I didn't make any money doing music for years. I continued to make it, but I think that a lot of us were too poor to give a shit about some of those bigger things, or maybe it just felt like we were really struggling to survive. And I think a lot, I know in America, in after I was in Nina Hagen and I got back, the big band that was sort of really making a mark was Black Flag. And Black Flag had a label called SST, and they and I was really fat. That was right near my house, so I started hanging out with them. I got in a band with Des Cadena called DC3, and my sister got in Black Flag, and the Meat Puppets and the Minutemen. When people talk about the 80s bands, and I don't know what they're talking about. They're talking about really hideous music that I don't listen to, mostly with drum machines, and not that I don't like drum machines, but what I call new wave, what a lot of people were into. To me, the 80s were the Minutemen, Black Flag, the Meat Puppets, some of the SST bands like that. And then I discovered the Cure way later. I thought the Cure was this whiny pop band, and suddenly one day and everybody said, "You should really listen to the Cure." And one day I just said, "Oh, I love Robert," and then I listened to nothing but the Cure for 5 years.
Yes,
So that was the 80s for me.
God,
And I had two small kids. My older son was born in 81. My younger son was born in 83. And when you have 2 children, it occupies a fair amount of territory in your brain.
Well, it does, absolutely. And it was interesting you mentioned about the prog bands, because what I've sort of discovered, and you probably discovered it even more, that there's kind of almost, especially with popular music, there's almost like a 5-year chapter where, something happens, and then those bands, a lot of bands, this is a sweeping statement, they have that 12-month, 18-month honeymoon. I wouldn't say a honeymoon in a romantic way, but practice and they get the single. We had a DJ in this country called John Peel, who loved the kind of new music and the most obscure bands he could find. He'd play it, they'd get John Peel session, things going well, then they get the next album, they'd get their little tour bus, and you realize that the UK is really tiny, but everything, you can just go to all these little towns, play their alternative indie night on a Monday, Tuesday or Wednesday, and things are going really well. The band, they're getting a certain audience, and then the second album, then possibly the third, and by then they're sort of a bit burnt out. And that next wave of fans, like the next wave of 16, 18-year-olds are coming along, and they kind of want to discover their bands, the people who are just about to break it. And those other ones become quite bloated. It doesn't have to be Yes and Genesis and Jethro Tull. It can just be like the Smiths, or you know, I just, all these indie bands I've interviewed from the 80s, you know, it's like they get to about 80, 87, 88, and it's a bit like, yeah, you know, ecstasy comes along in this country, you know, and suddenly ecstasy, you know, this is again really sweeping, but you know, there's a different soundtrack, there's a different drug, there's a different sensation, and people want to dance suddenly. And in the early 80s, there was a huge amount of kind of unemployment in this country, and there was the kind of the right, which had all the money, and then the left, which had no money, and we were all scraping by on very little. So there's this huge kind of gap in society. So I think that does play a massive part, you know, and keeping on the zeitgeist is quite difficult at this stage.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I'm going to be 65 this year, so um, you know, there's this great surrender. One of the temptations is to disparage the new and say, well, you know, back in my day, we had the great music, you know. And what I always like to remind everybody is this is the best time for music there has ever been. I promise you, because there's so many more people doing it, and they've listened to all the music from the last 50 years, and they go on YouTube and figure out how to play guitar, and then and I know it because they walk into my studio and I record them. And not only are they kids doing incredible, unbelievable. My son sends me a new band once a week, and I'll check them out and I'll go, amazing on every level, fresh, unique, committed, brilliant. You know, every week there's a new one, and on top of that, this other syndrome, which I think is really fascinating. 6-year-old musicians who've been working their whole lives, have nothing to prove, and have had jobs now, and they walk into my studio and they go, I want to make an album. And we make a record, and halfway through the record I go, this is incredibly good. I mean, is it just because I'm biased because I'm helping with it? But it happened over and over again. And the thing is, it makes perfect sense. They're doing it for all the right reasons. They've got all this experience, and they're not doing it to make money or to impress anybody. They're making a pure work of art from their heart. So I find that like the example that is sort of, I think, is a mainstream example would be Nick Cave doing Ghost Teen. You know, the album that he did. You know, it's a beautiful album, and the guy does not care that whether you know, birthday party fans like it. He's 60 something years old, and he's trying to do what he believes now. He's not. And then there's many artists that go out and do the same music. I mean, I think of Trent Reznor, who I thought was a really, really great talent. And I have to say, I haven't really kept up on his music to say this, but I had a feeling that after several albums, he was still full of hate and anger. And I feel like, haven't you figured anything out? Are you pandering to your fans? Haven't you found now you have money, you can do anything you want. Haven't you found any peace, or are you afraid you'll lose your audience if you make music that way? Or have you been unable to evolve into a way where you can make a sincere statement of beauty without it appearing maudlin or insincere, you know? Because I think that's a real challenge. That's a challenge as an artist, to age and to not repeat yourself and to be honest about where you are in life. You know, my last record, a lot of the last record is like, hey, I'm old, I'm dying, I'm going to be dead, you know, and what is that like? Because that's all we have to sing about.
I know this is true. I know we have to face these things. What does an artist have to sing about now? It's kind of interesting.
16-year-old is not going to care. Does that mean I have to write something for them? I can't. They've got their own artists.
They do. I know. Well, that's why, you know, when we listen to Black Star, it's like, oh, that's what you sing about when you get a bit older. And still make it sound sincere and interesting. But what was quite interesting on some of those points you made, because I remember in the 80s being obsessed with the Smiths because they were my band, and playing it to my boss, who had been in the 60s world of Hendrix and the Grateful Dead and seen Cream and loving, and the Who. He was obsessed, and I'd play him the Smiths and he just didn't get it. And I thought, oh, actually, that's right. You know, you don't often people don't really get it, and I just assume that I accept that I'm the old person who hasn't got their finger on the zeitgeist anymore. When I see there's a gig, I don't know, there's a festival going on in our city in a couple of months' time, and there's got some events at sort of, I don't know, 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. I'm thinking, I'm not sure if I'm the target market anymore. I mean, I might be, but at the same time, it's not quite my focus anymore. So I accept that, the next generation come along, and I'm sure what they're doing is amazing. It has the same impact and same excitement as I had. But I'm the old dude at the gig, that kind of syndrome. When you were young, you went, who's the old person? And it's like, oh yeah, we all become that person one day, don't we? So you have to accept it.
I was playing with a band with Rick Agnew and Jatan Damone from Christian Death called the Jatan Damone Quartet. And we were playing with some young bands, but I consistently noticed in Los Angeles mixed audiences of older people and young kids. I thought it was, as boomers, or in the 60s, that you don't trust anyone over 30, and it was generational war, and that's kind of silly. It was a very, very romantic idea at the time, but it's actually a very silly idea, because really the old and the young should unite against power.
Yes, this is true. This is true. So we're talking about creative things, and I mentioned, I don't know, the Smiths and Morrissey. I mean, when he was singing in the sort of 80s, he seemed like, and I've spoke to a few musicians and artists about this, what is the creative moment and what makes it kind of pure and beautiful. And when people become slightly, like you talked about Trent, thinking, well, yeah, you definitely felt authentic then, and now you just feel like, are you quite so authentic, or are you just pretending to be kind of angry? And I found that a little bit with some people like Morrissey. Is like there was a genuine feeling of like, that's how you were, feeling alienated, poor, poverty stricken. And now the sentiments just sound a bit bitter and unpleasant now. There is something kind of like, God, you're just a bit of a bitter old man now. Whereas then you just seem like one of us, a rather lost young person on stage waving your gladioli about. And I suppose it's having that kind of creative honesty as an artist that makes your best work, compared to sort of just sounding a bit like, no, that just sounds a bit like you've become a bit unpleasant, really.
Well, the question is, has he changed? Has he gotten more bitter and less open-minded? Was there a green, living, inspired child in his early work that has been lost? Or is it the same thing and it just doesn't age well? And I don't really want to say that about Trent. I had that feeling about Trent, but I would like to listen to some of his new music, because I actually have faith in Trent Reznor. I believe that I could find I believe that what I said might not be true, but I just haven't been exposed to it. But I think it's really the death of creativity. A real challenge is success. When you have success, and you're making a living, and you own a house, or you own 3 houses, or you own 7 houses, whatever your station that you've gotten to through your art, and you hire 40 people for your tours, and they're all counting you to hire them for the next tour. And, this fear comes in about losing, about not being, losing your livelihood, or having to downsize your livelihood, or you're having your fans turn on you. And it's very legitimate. And if that's, I mean, how many people are able to continue to be, really creative once that's happened? I know it's a real challenge. I actually am somewhat grateful that I was spared that. I mean, I'm living a comfortable life. I have my own recording studio. I work very hard, but I don't have fans, millions of fans that are going to either turn on me. My God, being a celebrity is horrible, especially in the age of social media. I mean, just read the comments section. There may be 50 fans that say lovely things about you, but then there's going to be 50 fans or ex-fans, or just haters saying the most horrible, loathsome things about you. I mean,
yes, I could imagine that kind of being a difficult one. So with your studio, when did you decide to make that kind of change from, I'm going to be want to be in the band? Because you've played with so many different people, haven't you, over the decades?
Yeah.
And then
I still do, but I always made home recordings. And I think always, from the time I was about 14 or 15 years old, just about every move I've ever made and every decision I've ever made was with the goal of being able to have a studio time so I could record. So it used to be get some indie label to put us in the studio to record. And I did that for a while. And then I had a series of 8-tracks in my house. And 8-tracks was kind of good enough. And I did 8-tracks obsessively through the 90s when we were almost to the 90s. And if you were going to talk about the 90s, I would say I missed the 90s. I was locked. I was working as a construction worker in the daytime, and I was locked in these 8-track studio in my garage every moment. And I just released all that music last year, 4 double albums of it. So everything was to eventually have a recording studio. And so finally, my friend Geza X and my other friend Josie Cotton had a recording studio. And Geza was a well-known producer, and I played in bands with him, but he just didn't want to be sitting in the chair anymore because it's very grueling, and he wanted to start to move away. So he kind of threw me into his chair to start engineering. And it was all with the goal, well, then in nighttime when everybody leaves, I can work on my own stuff. And so that was a studio up in Malibu. And then in 2011, we closed that one down, and we built this one in this one that I'm sitting in now. We built this in 2011, and I've basically just been sitting in this room.
Are you in LA?
Much. Yes, very close to Ground Zero, right near downtown Los Angeles.
Right, because I think last year I did an interview with a guy who was in a band called, is it Pulsars? A guy called Dave, is it Trumfila? Called, he's got a sort of the king size sound labs where he's got studio and kind of hotel all put together into one. But you haven't come across that guy.
Things go through my brain, and if they're not useful, then they quickly go out the other side of my ears. So I may have, but you'll ask this probably again, and I'll go, I don't know.
Don't worry.
The worst that ever happened was I ran into some guy at a show, and he's like, Paul, how are you doing? And I'm like, hey, who are you again? And he's like, I was in a band with you. And I was like, oh my God.
Yes. So the commitment of making a studio, I mean, that must have been quite a big kind of step. Was that a relief to sort of move away from thinking I could still be in a band one day to, no, this is going to be my focus for the next 10 years?
Well, my dreams were shattered back around 1987. In 1987, I think I put out, all through the 80s, I was getting all these I was putting out an album on SST, and I was putting out an album on CD Presents, and I was working with Mike Watt in a band called Crime, and I was in DC. I was doing all this stuff, and it all came out in 87. And I thought, when this happens, people are going to really think I'm a big deal. And it was nothing. So at that point, I had to start thinking, well, how am I going to support my kids? And I never was really able to get a real job. I just kind of did odd jobs, but the odd jobs were kind of, and then every once in a while I get a gig. I played with a guy named Mark Curry who was on Virgin Records, or I get some tours, but so I never, it's been quite a while since there was a long period, probably 15 or 20 years when it didn't look like I was ever going to be able to make a living doing music, really. And then around 2003 to 2004, they really had me working full time at the studio. And was it a relief? Well, when I was doing those other jobs, I felt like I was, and sometimes I think back about painting houses and I go, God, that was nice. It was quiet, and I would be working outside, and it was so relaxing, but it wasn't. It was hellish. I tortured myself every minute thinking that this is not what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be like my dad wanted. I'm supposed to be a great genius, and my life is slipping through my fingers. So yes, there was a relief to know that I could, all this stuff that I had sort of demoed out, all these ideas that I hadn't been able to realize I would eventually be able to, as well as I could, make decent versions and throw them out into the world for whatever. And then every once in a while, a couple people will hear a song and it will mean something important to them,
Yes.
And that means a lot. I have a couple friends, the last album I did, and they'll say something like, I can't stop listening to it. And I know, like, when you have a record that you can't stop listening to, that's like a kind of bliss, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a kind of bliss in this world where there's so little bliss. When you find a piece of music that you just listen to over and over because it just moves you so much. So, if I've given a handful of people that kind of bliss, and every once in a while someone will tell me that, and I'll feel like, wow, and I mean, I just like the other kind of bliss of, look at me, I'm at the top of the charts, and now I can read thousands of people saying horrible things about me or kissing my ass and telling me how great I am. It no longer has the same allure. It
Yes,
never had that much allure. It had a little allure. It has a lot less. It has very little allure now.
were you able to sort of have a little bit of kind of help and emotional support with your sister, Kira, at that stage? Because she'd obviously gone through quite a kind of a weird and rough period being the bassist in Black Flag, and I spoke to her, and it sounded quite rough at times and quite mean. I just wondered if
you have to remember that Black Flag was either on tour or rehearsing every single day, and she was going to UCLA full time to get a degree in computer science and business. So Kira, for that period of time, we would talk very rarely. She was so, and I always want to point out that that's one of the most amazing accomplishments. I think one of the greatest accomplishments of sheer endurance and willpower, to be able to be a woman in Black Flag and be going to UCLA at the same time is just incredible. And then after that, she went out, she moved to New Haven, and she was kind of away a lot. It's really only in the last 10 years that we've really started doing a lot of music together. And I play in her band now. And we see each other a lot more,
yes,
we have a constant text thread that's going on with my son and her about basketball. Every day I'll get 50 texts about basketball. So it's really the last 10 years. When I was going through my hardest time, while she did try to be helpful at times, and when she was going through her hardest time, we weren't able to be of great help to each other. It's just sad, but it's wonderful to really, truly be reunited with her now.
yes, that is something. Did you have a drug dependency at that stage back then?
So in 1993, my wife was a really severe drug addict, methamphetamine addict, and we had 2 kids, so I was always trying to like throw her needles in the trash and flush her drugs down the toilet, and I was bail her out of jail, and I was like Mr. Goody Goody guy trying to keep the family together. In 1993, I was losing this battle. I was losing the battle. We were living in absolute chaos. And I thought, if I got on the drugs too, she wouldn't have to lie to me, and I could be on the inside of this thing. And I think I can manage it. And I think I think that if it's not me trying to control her, I think it'll be better than it is now. And now the other options would have been to leave her or to take the kids and go, but I really couldn't figure out how to do that. I didn't want to do. My parents had gotten divorced at around the same time, and I didn't want to do that to my kids. So I made this really, really crazy decision to be a drug addict, and it was, and out of that, and it actually, in many ways, it really worked, because we did stop fighting, and we did stop the money did stop disappearing out of my account, and things did settle down, and I sort of had a creative breakthrough, because it was also around the same time as I was doing these construction jobs, and I'd come home from work at 5 o'clock and be so exhausted I couldn't drag myself to band practice or into the studio. And I thought, this is going to give me, the endurance to do the stuff I can't do. This probably sounds like a lot of rationalization and justification, but it was all very, very reasoned and thought out and logical. And I was on methamphetamine from about 93 to 2000, early 2002.
Right.
And I've been sober since then.
My God, that's quite something. Did you become quite damaged at that stage during that period?
Oh, I was damaged when I stopped. Because there's brain chemistry issues, and there's, it was during it. I mean, I have to say, the worst chaos, this is going to sound crazy, the worst chaos was before I did it, because I was in such a, it was so emotionally destructive to be in that marriage, as it stood, with me trying to be the hero and her being the identified patient, was a very, very toxic. And actually, it actually did settle things down and help. I don't have terrible memories of that period, particularly creatively, because I listened to the music I did before, and it's a little precious. I hear I hear myself grow up, and I hear my soul being transformed in the furnace through that. And so was I damaged? I mean, for sure I was very damaged before already, though.
Yes.
You
Now,
know,
how did you manage to sort of come out of that period? Because often it's the problem is being in the environment of something that's so difficult. And I've been aware that, you know, the people that you hang with have such a huge influence, even if you're,
I
you
mean, I
know,
can tell you exactly. My kids had gotten old enough to know, and my kids had gotten old enough to start to want to do drugs. And it was really clear to me that while I thought I could handle these drugs from inside of me, from my inner life, I could handle these drugs. But on the outside, in the world, my being on drugs was having an effect outside on my kids. So I had to look outside of myself. Now I was doing the drugs to medicate the inside. When I didn't
yes,
understand that by medicating the inside, I wasn't helping the outside. The outside was going to hell, even though I was feeling better. So then it had to be a decision. Well, okay, I may never do music again. I may never be happy again or feel good again, but I cannot continue to be an example of a drug addict with two children in the house. And how I did it was, I mean, I went to 12-step meetings.
right.
That yeah, maybe not for everybody, but for me and for many people I know, many musicians and many, I mean, I know David Bowie was a big 12-step guy, as you know. You
Yes, him and
know,
Tony Visconti would go off and do their thing.
he was very open about it. He was very open about it at a certain points in his career. I like to throw that out there for people who reach a point where they're like, I can't go on and I can't stop, and I don't know what possible catalyst can make a change happen. And in my life, it was knowing people that had done it in 12-step groups and going, okay, I give up. I hate the idea of this. I absolutely hate the idea of this, but it's working for Jack and it's working for, Robbie, and it's working for them. So I'm just going to shut up and just do what they do and see what happens. And, then while the insides didn't change drastically, the insides, there was a lot of suffering and pain, but the outsides began changing almost immediately.
Yes. And how did your wife or partner, did she go through the same process, or was that just not going to happen?
She went through something similar, but you know, she was kind of cleaning up and going in and going out. But eventually, after I'd been sober about 3 years, I realized that, so it's interesting about family dynamics. If you studied the nature of addiction in the family, the damage lasts much longer. So me getting sober did not suddenly fix everybody. It actually took me leaving that family, I believe. About 3.5 years after I got sober, I left that family, and I'm still very, very close to all of them, and I love them. But the enmeshment was so toxic. It just wasn't the rest, everybody wasn't getting well. And I moved away, and about 3 years after that, after I left, then it really kicked in for them as well. And now
Right.
I can really say that all of us survived this really, really rough period. And by the way, not to do like a plug here, but I recorded all the music during that period, and I put it all together in 4 albums called The Drug Years. And I just put it out on Bandcamp. And it's kind of interesting. People probably imagine this horrible tweaker music, but it's really, a lot of it's like Elton John, and just like the kind of, 9 Inch Nails or Elton John. And I've re-recorded a lot of it, but it's almost like a diary of that period. It's a lot of the observations. Let's face it, methamphetamine, your synapses are really firing at a red hot level. And in some ways, some very intense insights and stuff came out of that period. And if I didn't feel that way, I would never have released it all. But
Yes.
I took 20 years, and I polished it, and I remixed it, and I re-recorded some of the songs. And finally I said, during COVID, I was like, I could get COVID and die, or I could stroke out tomorrow, and it's never going to be perfect, but I want to just make it all available. So I put out my sort of musical diary of the drug years on Bandcamp, if
Yeah.
anybody's
Did
curious
that?
about it.
Yes, I'll check that out. Did that help you also process that period as well, having that kind of moment of, you know,
Absolutely. Absolutely, because in the daytime I was a construction worker, handyman with a drug addict wife and two young kids, and I was incredibly poor. At nighttime, I was Zeus, making the music was just pouring through me, and I could absolutely process. I remember one time my wife said, nobody likes you. You have no friends, and nobody likes you. And she insulted me so way, and I went out, and it instantly turned into this beautiful song about how important it is to have human contact. You know, um, like the idea of we're supposed to all be very independent, and we're supposed to be, but really no one's independent. Really, we're all entwined, and it's so yes, that music is what was at my absolute focus, to keep me joyous, really passionate and joyous through that period.
blimey, the drug years. It's 12 Steppers and Dead Junkies Part 1,
Yeah,
and you got
Fireman,
the drug
Boy
years as well.
Scout.
God,
Yeah.
that's an extraordinary diary. So a lot of people use the lockdown as a sort of a way to do processing and archiving and going into their loft and finding stuff and writing memoirs. So your period as well had an equally sort of creative time of tidying stuff up, taking stock. Because you record a new album, isn't it? The Turn Into the Bright World.
I had been working on that since I got into this studio, really. But I mean, oof, someone told me it's not good to say you worked on a record for 8 years or 10 years or 20 years, but like, I was doing others. I wrote a 21-minute song called Galatea that, I would produced 40 bands or something in that time. So I was kind of constantly working on the Turning of the Bright World. And one of the reasons it took so long was it was just a collection of songs to me. It didn't strike me as a unified album, which is really my art form. My art form is the album, not the song, which is a very obsolete art form now. It's not, nobody sits through a 40-minute piece anymore. That's like more of what we were talking about before. We're old codgers that do things that in a way that is no longer, I watch TikTok with my wife, and they're 15 seconds and they're fun and they get in and out. It's great. But I still compose big pieces and major big works because I've been turning the Bright World. It just seemed like a collection of songs. And then we went up to the poppy bloom, and Rachel took that picture of me on the cover, and I sort of saw what the album was about, and the songs I threw out a bunch of songs that I didn't want to use, and I put in the songs I did want to use, and it sort of came together. But I had been working on it for a while, and I got to tell you, through the pandemic, the studio did not slow down. The rules for the lockdown was after 2 weeks, it was no gatherings of more than 5 people. That was what it really, a lot of people wore masks and huddled and wouldn't go anywhere. But a lot of my work is with one other artist at a time. And the first week, someone dropped off about 100 DATs and asked me to digitize them all. 100 DATs, it was probably 30 hours of music, and asked me to master all of it. He was archiving.
Right.
So I immediately got this massive job. By the time I was done with that, somebody else said, "Hey, I've recorded an album in lockdown. Could you mix it?" And they send that to me. And, it didn't slow down a tremendous amount. A lot of people were doing things remotely and virtually.
Yes, absolutely, they did. And just curious, actually, on that cover of the Turning of the Bright World, where did you capture it, and what does it symbolize? I was just curious.
Well, so we went up and she was taking pictures of me. We took a lot of pictures, and all of them were bad. And she's an amazing photographer. And I didn't like any of them. And that one was just a Polaroid that she caught as we were getting ready to get in the car. And, a lot of the album I was talking about is kind of like the idea of death is so ubiquitous and so inevitable. And yet it is like in people's minds, it's sort of the essence of evil in a way. And I really was like the idea of, if you could really celebrate and just let go of this fear and this sense and celebrate it a little bit. And I noticed when I was looking through songs, because when I write songs, it's very subconscious. I'll write the music and I'll go out and I'll go, blah, 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 and I'll just sing melodies. And then I'll go, now, what am I saying there? Oh, there's a A and a P, and gradually like these words sort of swim up, and it's exhausting, and it takes hours and hours and hours and hours. And I don't know what the song is going to be. And the wisdom of the song is from my subconscious and from the music, the integrity of the music and the emotion and the wisdom of the music. And so I had to step back afterwards and go, well, what are these songs really singing about? And a lot of them were really sensing my impending death and feeling very, very accepting of it. So that picture on the cover, the turning of the bright world is like, like what we were talking about. We will be gone and the world will go on without us, and it'll be awesome.
Yeah, so you've got tracks like Maker, The Only Thing That Matters, Awake. These all have a theme, don't they? A thematic quality to them.
Especially Elephant Man, especially the first. I was writing the words to Elephant. I really love that music. It's a free improvisation. I just improvise it. It doesn't have verses, chorus. It doesn't repeat. And I had this music that I loved, and I was sitting there and I was writing these words. I'm like, oh, these words are terrible. They don't mean anything. And then finally I realized, oh my God, that's a guy dying. His spirit is leaving his body, and his tenses, and it's like his life is flashing before his eyes. So that's kind of why it's first. There's really and then he's in peace with it. He's at peace with it. So, and then Maker is sort of a really silly poppy version of the same theme. But then, I also thought one of the other things about it was like, well, if you're an old man and you're moving on to the next world or to nothingness, do you have anything to leave behind? Is there anything that are there any conclusions you've come to? Is there any, and I'm very cautious about having beliefs or coming to conclusions. I'm against it. I'm against having opinions, and I'm against any of that, because every time I ever have an opinion, I am quickly disabused of it and proven that I had my head up my ass, which I also love. But,
yes,
I'm an old man, and do I have anything that I've settled on? And that is a theme that continuously kind of, the only thing that matters, and, Shallow, Shadow Complete, and Awake. There's a bunch of different ones in there that are about just philosophical stuff, different philosophers that have resonated with me.
Yes, absolutely. And did you on the recording process? Obviously, you did most of it, or all of it, in your studio there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
I did almost all of it myself. I mean, I had a couple guest musicians, but most of the songs I just do it myself. That's kind of how I like to work. I find that my music, when I have a real standard instrumentation, like a guitar player, bass player, and drummer, I feel like my songs suddenly become trite. I don't know why. There's one exception to that, and that's a song called A Quiet Night on the Moon Cam. It's the only song that's really a drummer. We got a drummer and a bass player and a guitar player, and I played piano, and we played the song, and then I had this 7-minute thing, and I was like, now I got to write words to it. And I just sat there for a month and I was kind of inspired by Bo Burnham. The music, I was kind of inspired by Neil Young, this song, Cortez the Killer, where there's this really, really long intro that's just awesome. It's like nothing is really happening. It's not like it's some great guitar solo. But you just swim in this long intro. So I wanted to do that. And then Bo Burnham, I've been listening to a lot of Bo Burnham and Phoebe Bridgers, and my God, what it's like to be 25 or 26 or 27 in 2027, to have been born in 2000. It's a very bleak, you're born into a very bleak world, apparently, partly because of the 24-hour news cycle. But, and I realized, like, people like Phoebe Bridgers and Bo Burnham, when they think about their future, they don't think there is one. There's a very pessimistic feeling. And so I'm a deliberate, intentional optimist, because I feel like pessimism is corrosive, and you have to be an optimist even if you're on your way to the gallows, because it gives you courage, But I decided I'm going to go ahead and be pessimistic. I'm going to have a song of, that's the philosophy of that song, is pessimism.
Right. Yes, this is all true. I mean, because it was such a long process, you know, I think, did you say you started it in sort of 2014,
14,
2015?
yeah. The earliest songs are from 2014.
Did it feel sort of trying to sort of then bring it together and then sort of put it into an order, you know, a playlist? Did that feel quite tricky? Sort of because obviously you must have changed and so much had changed in the world during that time of, you know, there was political
Well, the
shifts that
songs,
were huge.
yeah, but the songs, the themes of the songs are pretty timeless. You know, they're pretty inward, and some of them are very handled in a sort of a pointillist and fractured way where it's not always obvious what's going on. So like I said, it took a long time to put together because I didn't have a vision. Once I had a vision, um it wasn't that hard. Once I saw, like, okay, this song doesn't make you know, I just saw that, okay, the songs together do hold together, they do tell a story, you know. So um it's always hard to do a really exhausting part of the process of an album is finishing it, the very
Yes.
final thing, because man, you're hearing stuff up to the last second, which means that you're going to hear stuff afterwards. But you know,
Yes, this is true.
I
Of course,
can't,
it's interesting you mentioned that track by Neil Young, Cortez the Killer, because there is something like you when you go to play it, you kind of sit down, don't you, thinking that this is going to be a process. This isn't a TikTok moment, isn't it? It's like you're going to go through it. And then there's another track by Gillian Welch called Time's a Revelator, and that again is like this very long process. And to really, you know, to really appreciate it and to get something from it, you know, you have to sit down, clear your diary for the next 8 minutes, and just kind of go with it till the very end because you kind of miss the
yeah,
point, don't you?
singing doesn't even start till 3 minutes into it. But you know, honestly, I turn it off for the singing because you know, those lyrics, which were very, very revolutionary and woke when he wrote them, are actually very dated and very almost racist now, you know. So you know, and that's like you've got a point. Like if you don't get the music out there, I remember I had a song in the drug years called Taliban Girl. And no, when I wrote Taliban Girl, nobody had heard of the Taliban. The Taliban were an unknown. You know, I just happened to read a lot of books, you know. So I thought nobody will know what this is about. And now to everybody, you know, Taliban Girl, ha ha ha, everybody, you know, gets it. So yeah, times change and something, you know, become dated. It's true.
Since you're kind of this kind of the kind of, I wouldn't say cleansing, but obviously, and it's not quite your Black Star album either, but obviously doing your archives with your drug years, and then this kind of album, which is captures the last, I suppose, last 8 years of your life. Does it now, as a person, do you feel like, right, okay, that's cleaned that? I mean, I know you've got your studio and you've probably got 100 different people sort of squeezing into the diary and sort of working that out. But do you feel like, right, what are you going to work on next?
You ask the most wonderful questions. You really do. And I really appreciate you for the questions you ask because it's absolutely what I want to talk about. And yes, when I put out the drug years, which had been 30 years of work and 5 hours of music, and then when I put out the Turning of the Bright World, I felt absolutely drained and like I have nothing else to say. I've said everything I want to say, and I may never write another song. And then I remembered that I'm in the middle of a project with an artist I'd mentioned before named Chatan Damone, who was in Christian Death and who I've been playing with. And 6 years ago, she said, I want to do an album of orchestral music. And I was like, that's just not a good idea. I just can't imagine that. And we went to a concert and um, we saw the Hosts of Planets. And it was,
Oh
you know,
God, doesn't.
it was okay, you know, it's a war horse. It was okay. But the opening act was the debut of a violin concerto by an Icelandic composer named Daniel Bjarnason. So this is a piece that was written in 2017, and it was unbelievable. It made the planets sound like just silly. It was so beautiful and complex and odd and strange. And so I was like, okay, if I'm going to write orchestral music, that's what it's got to be like. I cannot be lazy. I can't fall into like so I worked on it, and poor Shaitan, I was writing this stuff and I was like, nobody can sing to this. This is going to be impossible. I'm deliberately making it not only impossible to learn and to play, but for her to write to. And yet she would work hard. She would write 50 or 60 pages of lyrics and distill it down to one thing. And I would help her through it. And so tomorrow she's coming in tomorrow night, and she's going to be putting on the final vocals for this piece. It's 28 minutes long. It's in 7 sections, and I'm not writing lyrics to it, but I am so freaking proud of it. And it's because she's a goth artist. I feel like old goth people will and it's pretty exciting. It doesn't sound like anything else. I'm only using pianos and violins and instruments. I'm doing it on MIDI, only instruments that you would hear in a symphony orchestra. And yet, I worked pretty hard on it, and she brought out something out of me that I'm so fucking proud of. So that's the next thing. And if you would have asked me before I got back to working on it, because I kind of set it aside, I would have thought I was done, but she's just really given me a gift, because I feel like I'm doing just the best work of my life, honestly. And I don't even have to write the words. Usually I feel like the words are what, me wanting the right words are really, really important to me. And so just to be sitting in the background, making the music for her, and her really rising to it, I'm thrilled.
Yes, because you've obviously collaborated with quite a lot of people, but this obviously sounds like a much more, well, not much more, but just another really interesting new person. A bit like, I suppose, Bowie used to sort of put together these bands and sometimes take a whole band, as he did on his last album. But this sounds like a really interesting new conversation, a new narrative, and a new kind of
brand new. It's brand new. It doesn't sound like anything. I think Beck put out an album of orchestral stuff years ago, and I remember listening to it and going, and people love Beck. I have never really discovered him completely, but I'm sure he's really brilliant. But I remember just not. But this is way more. This is almost like Stravinsky or something. But and yet Chetan is singing kind of rock and roll over Stravinsky. If you can imagine a rock and roll singer wailing over Stravinsky, that's kind of what we're talking about.
Yes. Did you, I'm not sure because I haven't heard the music, but did you used to get very excited when you used to listen to Funeral for a Friend and Love Lies Bleeding? Was that kind of...
No, that was not one of my favorite overtures. I love Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, though. I remember Harmony. I thought there was many beautiful songs. I was a big Elton John fan in the 70s for sure. But that intro, it didn't give me quite the rush you're talking about. There's some Emerson, Lake and Palmer doing Jerusalem, maybe.
Right. Yes, I know. God, you've really sort of captured your sort of an essence of your sort of deep in your DNA here, haven't you?
My pretentious, ponderous essence, which, people talk about being pretentious, and I'm like, is that a bad thing?
But it's great. It's great when you go back to the source, isn't it? And obviously this is part of your source that you've come, that the kind of where the stream starts, isn't it?
To an extent. I never had mastering, and it's actually really brand new for me. People will sometimes ask me to do an orchestra on their records, and I've come to learn, like, oh, that's what a piccolo's for, and that's what a flute does, and that's what French horns do. I get it now. Slowly I figured out, like, why do they have so many instruments? Oh, they all do. Timpanis, they're actually really important, So I started finally figuring out how an orchestra works together, and it's wild. And yes, you're right. I'm recording bands. I've recorded a band Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, a band called the Hollywood Stars, that are these 74-year-old Sunset Strip rock and roll guys that are rediscovering their youth. Just the weirdest, strangest projects come in here, and I try to give it my heart. There's so many people that kind of count on me. They really count on me. There's an artist called Fido, who is a prog artist that I work with a lot, who's got, it's spelled Phideaux, and prog fans may know about him. And a lot of people really count on me. Harry Cloud, like they can't necessarily do their art without me. It's a real responsibility.
Yes, this is true. Going back to your own project that you're working on, how important is kind of space and a sort of stillness sometimes within the music that you're currently making? Because I remember sort of being very mesmerized by some of these classical artists who play piano, but it's very spacious. But it goes back to people like Eric Satie and people like that. I just wondered, do you sort of struggle sometimes keeping sort of like a stillness and not making it too busy as well with your
Well,
latest project?
I'm something of a maximalist, you know. I am not a minimalist. I mean, I've got some songs that are kind of very simple piano stuff, but that's usually a departure for me. I will say that there are spots in this piece. It's a 28-minute piece. There are spots where everything does kind of stop and float and hang, and they're really, because there's a lot of torturous, you know, there's a lot of rise and falls. There's all kinds of stuff, but those moments where it becomes really simple and spare, you know, it just takes your breath away because you've had this huge, like, things have gotten just as epic as they could get, and then they just go to just like maybe Jatan's voice and maybe just a piano or just a flute or a slight float. So
Yes. And how
yeah,
did
no, that's
And how did you get to the
powerful.
end? And how did you work out? Well, actually, you're just working it out, aren't you? I just wondered because you were talking about completing an album or completing a song, and just
It's a
thinking,
28-minute piece. I'll tell you what it's, I mean, I don't really want to tell people what it's about, but when you ask questions, I think you deserve answers. People deserve answers. So Shaitan initially came to me and she wanted to write a few of these orchestral pieces about the singer from Christian Death, Roz Williams, who hung himself when he was 37. So it's been 30 years and he hung himself. And I was like, this is really interesting because I had a really, really close friend, was a huge, made a huge impression on me, who committed suicide when he was 22, and that's Darby Crash. We were very, very close friends. So we both had this in common. And I go, but you know, it's so tawdry, this idea of, you know, the kid becomes a punk rock star and kills himself. What a trite story. So what we did is we put the funeral in the middle. The death happens in the middle of the piece. So there's this very fast, meteoric, and I'll tell you, the way Chaton writes words, this is not obvious. But this, you're asking about the structure. There's this childhood, discovery of the Hollywood scene, and this meteoric career and death. And then the music changes quite a bit, and it becomes the first piece after the death. The funeral is like you're staring at the grave, talking to him, like, you know, you could have done this, you could have done this, we would have helped you, like you're talking to him, like it didn't have to be this way. And then she wrote a piece about it's his journal, and it's 28 years later, and he didn't do it, and he's happy, and he's in love. And so it's really about surviving, and that's not, and what about the people? Everybody loves the story of the martyr that dies young, but that's kind of a failure, really. And what about, and you know, David Foster Wallace talks about this in The Pale King. What about, you know, the heroism of living and not you know, trying to be strong and help and not running away, you know? And
mm,
what is that about? And that, you know, these people that we put on a pedestal that die young, like Jimi Hendrix or Darby Crash or Roz Williams, what if we kept working? Do we eventually surpass them? You know, and that's what I said to Jatan. I said, you know, he was wonderful. They were wonderful. They didn't finish their work. And we're
mm.
good to finish our work. And our body of work, you know, I don't care if anyone knows it, you know, my goal is that my body of work will be complete. So that's kind of like the scope of the story, you know. And then so it's very, and that gives her a place to work out her poetry, you know.
Yes, my God, that's a big project, isn't it? You don't want to say, God, you've got to get it right, but you kind of got to get it right, haven't you, on such a
I'll
subject?
tell you, we'd had all the first 6 pieces were done, and all I had was the finale. This is the last thing. And I'm like, is she going to do it? Is she going to do it? She's done it 6 times. Can she do the 7th one? I'm so nervous. This has got to be the final thing. And she told me what her idea was, which I'm not going to really say what the idea is because it doesn't matter what the idea was. She told me the idea, and I was like, oh my God, that's so scary. I don't know if that's going to work. I don't know if it's going to work. And she went out and sang it, and just once more. And look, I become very full of myself working on these incredibly complex, elaborate classical pieces. I start feeling very proud of myself. And she walks in and sings something, and my music is just background music. And that's wonderful. It's wonderful. So yeah, that I had that absolute fear of like, you better get it right on the seventh piece. And she just she's really a witch. She makes amazing things happen.
Wowza, God. I mean, you must think, wonder what we'll do next.
Well, I mean, again, I would have felt I don't know, maybe I'll have a baby. That's on the table. I don't know. But I will say I'm not as afraid about what I'll do next because this happened.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to, I'll tell you what I'm looking forward to do. I'm looking forward to coming here and messing around and just having fun. And, that's how it starts.
To see what left is, to see what's in the soul of your consciousness and what comes out.
I don't feel driven, I don't feel driven. And Nick Cave had these terrible tragedies happen to him and it pulled out this amazing art. I tell you, I don't really want to have tragedies. I don't care. I mean, this is the first time in my life where I don't feel, I can help all these other people. It's a full-time job, I'll tell you, and
yes,
I can do that for a little while. And maybe there's another record in me, but I have to say the last record was the record I've been working towards my whole life. I didn't know it at the time, but when I listened to it now, I was like, yeah, I mean, I may hit on subjects like identity. There's a song called They. It came out of my grandchild came out as non-binary. And I had to process that,
yes.
And it's a really big subject, a really, really big subject. And they and I wrote the music together. They played ukulele. They were like only 13 or 14 and they played ukulele and the song that came out, and like that is a subject I would not consciously tackle. I would not consciously tackle the subject of the fluid genders. I wouldn't do it. But with that person together, something came out that I never can need to address that subject again, And there's a song on there called Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time, which is really about my take on, well, both, the consumerism and the devouring of resources on the planet. It's a very big subject. I think it's a really important subject. It's a very hard subject not to write a very bad song about.
Yes, this is
very
true.
bad song. Just did a whole album on it, and I don't know if it's any good. I feel like I wrote one good song. I never redid another. And I think I handled it. So lightly, and I feel like it's like you get to the truth of it. Is like the truth of it is we're doing it. We are. You and me are doing it.
Yeah.
It's not them. We are doing it every day, and and if you start there, and why? Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. It's very. So there's a bunch of subjects like that I don't see. Now maybe there's something I missed, but I'm going to have to live more to learn that,
Yes, well, it's good that you've dealt with some of those subjects because they are very confusing for
yeah. And I've had the experience of writing a song and going back years later and just shuddering. So I know you can get it so wrong, but I feel like, I've been burned by doing that. And I understand that I don't go pointing my finger at people and angry. I'm either fatalistic or, I show that I'm like that too, I'm part of the problem.
Yes.
So I don't know.
Yeah. We're just spinning around on the planet, aren't we? So we're doing our best. I think that's the main thing. When you get older, you think, well, I'm more conscious now, but I'm just doing my best. I can't I can't beat myself up. I think that's the important thing, isn't it?
Well, unless beating yourself up affects change. If it doesn't affect change, all you're doing is feeling self-pity and you're just making yourself feel bad. People tell me there's a role for anger. I think if you're angry, you make bad decisions. That's my personal take. Other people say, no, anger will motivate you to affect change. And that's possible. I do think sitting there and feeling self-satisfied, which I would love to do, and feeling like, well, I try to be a little bit more demanding of myself, but what I do know is that one thing I can do is put out beauty into the world, and that's kind of my job, is to, like, people come in here, and by beauty, I don't mean that it has to be like, you know, pretty. I mean,
Yes.
I mean profound, art that at least can give people that bliss for a few minutes while they're listening to it, and that seems like what I have to give. And so whatever can get my mind in the state where I can do that the most effectively, whether it's self-abuse once in a while. I told the guys in here, because sometimes people get in fights in the studio. I go, when you're listening to music, you start judging it based on your mood. Like, you're in a bad mood and you'll hear it one way. You're in a good mood, you'll hear it a different way, and you'll fuck up your mix depending on your mood. So I try to have one mood. I've been trying to have one mood so that I can make good mixes, so that I don't get,
Yes.
you know what I mean? I don't know if it's going to work, but it's what I'm trying to do.
Oh,
Equanimity, I believe it's called.
this is true. I mean, I know this is a bit vague, but if you could have, told your 16-year-old self, or whispered something to your 16-year-old self, something as you were starting out, even if that person ignored you, is there anything in particular that you might have just said, oh, by the way, this would have been a good idea, even if you ignore it?
Um, You know, I guess, my mom tried to commit suicide when I was 13, and it was very traumatic experience for me. It was right at a time when I was really getting into music, and I was starting to do a lot of drugs. And I never had any therapy or anything for that. And I think that if I could have had therapy, there's certain aspects of my life, particularly in regard to my relationships with women, that I would have had a different, I would have been able to be a better partner in relationships, perhaps. Now, the caveat of that is all that heartbreak and bad relationships has pulled out music that is so emotional and so painful that I'm not sure I would want to tell that kid how to be healthy. It's like I could have had a nice, happy life, never been a drug addict, and been a music professor or something. And so what? I feel like the like we this one goes back to the very beginning of our conversation when we were talking about my dad putting all those pressure on me. And you go, oh, that's not good. And the suffering, being the person that was a hothouse flower and then forced to suffer, that to me is the opportunity to be the best that you could possibly be, because you have all the tools given to you as a young kid, and then all the hard life stuff to force you to grow up and have wisdom, and not salve yourself with a trip to the Bahamas, or a new purse or something, or a swimming pool, forced to find some sort of inner wisdom. So you know and that's not to say I have any of it, but I hesitate to tell that kid, to give him the wisdom to avoid the suffering. I mean, suffering is the touchstone of spiritual growth.
Yes, in those moments we learn a lot about ourselves and things, don't we?
I think I could have spared that kid pain. Would I have? Should I have? I'm not sure.
No, this is true. I know. It's interesting when you're in those moments, how you react, and then you look back at how you reacted. And sometimes you feel like, actually, it was a tricky period, but I'm pleased with myself. I got through it, and I didn't, I didn't get worse. It didn't get worse. I sort of, found myself in a position, took responsibility sometimes, and managed to move on. And that can feel like a really great thing.
The butterfly effect. If I would have told that kid to get therapy, I never would have gotten the screamers. It's like that. I would have stayed in college, and I would have said to screamers, "Hey, I love your band. I would have loved to join them, but I've got to get my education, instead of dropping out and making babies, and just being crazy." So
On the journey of life. Yes, well, this is amazing. I'm really looking forward to your next project. This is always good, isn't it? This is the best thing in life.
and I said earlier, you're a very good conversationalist. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, Paul, yes, I'll keep in touch and I'll send you a link if you want. And also, yeah, I'll look forward to hearing the new project. And I've been enjoying your new album as well. So it's been because it's on Spotify and Bandcamp. You all got all your work on Bandcamp. So I'll put a link on that as well. So that's great. But yeah, good luck and look forward to some gothic classical epic saga.
I will send you an MP3 of one of the pieces just so you can have an idea.
Yes, I'm really
Alright.
curious. I do love a bit of sort of, yeah, as a Rick Wakeman fan, you know.
It's very diverse. I'll send you one. If you want to hear more, I'll send you more.
Oh yeah,
I'll send you
okay.
one- I'll send you one to wet your whistle.
Wet my whistle. Okay, look, have a lovely night, and I'm going to yes, have breakfast. Take care. Thanks a lot.
Much. Bye.
All the best. Bye bye. And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. I'm sure you gathered that, actually. A massive thank you to Paul Roessler for giving me the time for that. And you can find a lot of his material on Bandcamp and various other places. I will give you some links afterwards. Anyway, this has been the C86 Show. David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do the C86 Show or just C86 Show. All these interviews have been archived. Aren't you lucky? You can find those on Spotify, iTunes, or Podbean. It's true. Anyway, look, have a great week. Stay safe.